Most people in Australia have these small 2-cent coins sitting in jars, drawers, or even loose in their pockets, without ever thinking twice about them. But what if I told you some of these ordinary-looking coins can actually be worth hundreds of dollars, even thousands of dollars, just because of rare mint errors, unusual strikes, or tiny details almost nobody notices? And in today's video, we're going to break down exactly which coins are secretly valuable, how to spot them in seconds, and why collectors are paying serious money for pieces most people would simply spend without a second thought. Let's get started with first coin. The 1969 Australian 2-cent coin has a quiet story hidden in its weight, its tone, and the way the metal ages over decades. Fresh from the mint, it carried a rich reddish glow, struck with the familiar frill-necked lizard design that symbolized a distinctly Australian identity. But over time, most of these coins lost that brilliance, dulled by circulation, scratches, and oxidation. Finding one today that still flashes that original mint luster is already uncommon, because the majority were heavily used in everyday transactions when 2 cents still had real purchasing power. The details matter here. The sharpness of the lizard's scales, the clarity of the lettering, the absence of contact marks. These are the subtle differences that separate an ordinary coin from one that collectors actually compete for. Now, where things become far more interesting is when the coin isn't quite normal. A slight shift during striking, a misalignment, or a flaw in the die can transform this otherwise common piece into something far more desirable. Some 1969 examples show off-center strikes, where the design is visibly pushed to one side, creating a dramatic visual imbalance that collectors love. Others might display die cracks running through the surface, almost like lightning frozen in copper, or even a cud where a chunk of the die broke away, leaving a raised, blob-like feature on the coin. These aren't just imperfections, they're minting accidents, and each one is unique, which is exactly why they attract attention in auctions. Condition pushes everything further. A heavily worn coin might only be worth face value in theory, but a sharply preserved uncirculated example, one that looks almost untouched, can command a noticeable premium. The surface should still reflect light smoothly, without dull patches, and the edges should remain crisp. Even minor differences, like fewer bag marks or better color retention, can influence how much someone is willing to pay. Collectors often compare multiple coins side by side, looking for that one piece that stands out just slightly more than the rest. When these factors combine, strong condition and a visible mint error, the value jumps significantly. A standard 1969 coin in nice shape might only bring a few bucks, but introduce a clear off-center strike or a bold die break, and suddenly it becomes a conversation piece that bidders actually chase. The more dramatic and obvious the error, the higher the interest, especially if the coin still retains decent overall eye appeal. In today's market, a typical uncirculated 1969 2-cent coin can sell for around $2 to $8, while error examples can range anywhere from $13,500 to over $17,500, depending on how strong and visible the mistake is, with standout pieces occasionally pushing higher in competitive auctions. Next coin gets sharper, stranger, and way more valuable. Next up, the 1973 Australian 2-cent coin doesn't rely on rarity alone to get attention. It builds its appeal through subtle detail, quiet variations, and the kind of minting quirks that only become obvious when you really slow down and look closely. At first glance, it's the same familiar copper piece with the frill-necked lizard stretching across the reverse, but this year tends to show stronger strikes on many examples, meaning the scales, claws, and fine textures often appear more defined than what you'd see on heavily circulated pieces. From other years, that sharpness becomes a key factor. because once those details wear down, they never come back, and most surviving coins have already lost that crisp finish through decades of use. What separates an average 1973 coin from one worth chasing is how well those original features have survived. A coin that still holds its deep reddish tone, without turning dark brown or patchy, immediately stands apart. Collectors notice the glow, the smoothness of the fields, and the absence of heavy contact marks. Even tiny nicks or scratches can drag the value down, while a cleaner surface pushes it upward. It's a game of small differences, and in this year, those differences matter more, because truly clean examples are harder to come across than people expect. But the real jump in interest comes when the coin shows something unusual, something that wasn't meant to happen. The 1973 issue is known among collectors for producing some visually striking mint errors, and these are the pieces that don't sit unnoticed for long. A rotated die error where the front and back of the coin don't align properly creates an immediate curiosity, because it's something you can demonstrate just by turning the coin in your hand. Double strikes add another layer, showing a ghosted or shifted second impression that gives the design a distorted, almost duplicated look. And then there are off-center strikes, where part of the design is missing entirely, replaced by a blank crescent of metal. Those tend to draw the most attention when the shift is large enough to be dramatic, but still leaves the date visible. Each of these errors tells a small story about what went wrong during production, and that story is exactly what collectors are buying. No two error coins are perfectly identical, which means each one carries a kind of individuality that standard coins simply don't have. Even among error pieces, the strength and clarity of the mistake play a huge role. Faint or barely noticeable errors might only bring mild interest, while bold, obvious ones can turn into competitive auction items. Condition still plays its part here as well. An error coin that's heavily worn loses some of its impact, while one that remains in higher grade keeps both its visual appeal and its value. That combination, clear error plus strong condition, is what pushes a 1973 2-cent coin into a completely different category compared to ordinary circulation pieces. In practical terms, a standard high-grade 1973 coin might sell for around $3 to $10. But once you step into the world of errors, the numbers change quickly. Rotated dies and double strikes can reach $18,000 to $25,000 or more, while strong off-center examples with clear detail often land between $10,000 and $13,000 depending on how dramatic and clean they are. The next coin doesn't just rely on errors, it starts to surprise in ways collectors don't always expect. Next up, by the time 1976 rolled around, the Australian 2-cent coin had already settled into everyday life, passing through countless hands without a second thought, which is exactly why finding a truly well-preserved example today feels unexpectedly rare. Most of these coins were used heavily, dropped into pockets, scraped across counters, and stacked in bulk, slowly wearing down the finer details of the frill-necked lizard until the once sharp design became soft and flattened. When you come across a 1976 piece that still holds strong definition, the scales clearly separated, the claws distinct, the lettering bold, it immediately stands apart from the sea of worn-out examples that dominate the market. The surface tells the real story. Many coins from this year have darkened unevenly, developing blotchy tones or dull patches from oxidation. But occasionally one shows up with a smoother, more even brown, or even traces of that original reddish copper glow. That visual appeal alone can shift how collectors view the coin. Because eye appeal often matters just as much as technical condition. Tiny marks, faint scratches, or edge knocks might seem insignificant at first glance, yet they quietly influence value, separating an average piece from one that feels noticeably cleaner and more desirable. What makes 1976 more intriguing isn't just condition, it's the quiet presence of minting irregularities that don't always shout for attention but become fascinating once spotted. Some coins were struck on slightly flawed planchets, resulting in clipped edges where a portion of the coin is missing in a smooth, curved cut. Others show strike-through errors, where debris or foreign material briefly interfered during minting, leaving behind unusual impressions or lines embedded into the surface. These features aren't instantly obvious unless you're paying attention. But once noticed, they completely change how the coin is perceived. Unlike dramatic off-center pieces that immediately catch the eye, many 1976 errors are more subtle, rewarding closer inspection rather than quick glances. That subtlety creates a different kind of appeal. Collectors who enjoy examining coins in detail often appreciate these understated mistakes more than bold ones. Still, when a stronger error appears, such as a larger clip or a clearer strike-through, it quickly becomes the kind of piece that draws competitive interest, especially if the rest of the coin remains in decent condition. There's also something compelling about how unpredictable these coins can be. Two coins from the same year can feel completely different, one dull and heavily worn, the other surprisingly sharp with an unusual flaw that gives it character. That unpredictability keeps collectors searching, because the next coin they examine might be the one that stands out just enough to be worth holding on to. In terms of value, most 1976 2-cent coins in high-grade condition tend to sit around $2 to $6, reflecting their overall availability. But once a noticeable error enters the picture, the range shifts upward. Clipped planchet examples can bring $14,000 to $15,000, while stronger strike-through errors often land between $13,000 and $14,000, depending on how clear and visually interesting they are. The next coin starts to push closer to modern times, and with that comes a different kind of rarity that isn't always easy to spot. Next up, the 1982 Australian 2-cent coin sits in an interesting space where age alone doesn't make it special, but survival in top condition absolutely does. By this stage, these coins had already spent years circulating alongside earlier issues, and most examples from this year show the clear signs of everyday use, flattened details, dull surfaces, and countless tiny marks from constant handling. That's why when a 1982 piece appears with a noticeably sharper strike, it immediately changes how it's perceived. The frill-necked lizard design, when preserved well, still carries depth and texture, with the scales standing out instead of blending into a smooth, worn surface. What really separates better examples is the overall finish. Coins that avoided heavy circulation tend to retain a more even tone, sometimes holding on to a subtle reddish-brown glow rather than the darker, almost lifeless appearance seen on worn pieces. The fields, the flat background areas, play a big role here. If they remain relatively clean and free from heavy scratches or scuffs, the coin feels far more appealing, even if the difference seems minor at first glance. Collectors often look for that balance between detail and surface quality, and in 1982 pieces, that balance can be surprisingly hard to find. Where things begin to shift from ordinary to interesting is in the presence of minting inconsistencies that give certain coins a completely different character. This year is known for producing examples with partial collar strikes, where the coin wasn't fully held in place during minting, resulting in a slightly expanded or uneven edge. It's the kind of detail you might miss unless you examine the rim closely, but once seen, it becomes a defining feature. Broad strikes are another variation, where the coin spreads outward more than normal due to the absence or failure of the collar, giving it a slightly wider, flatter appearance that feels different in hand. These aren't dramatic in the same way as extreme off-center errors, but they carry a technical interest that many collectors appreciate. They represent a moment during production where something didn't function exactly as intended, and that moment is permanently captured in the metal. The more clearly visible the effect, whether it's a noticeably expanded edge or a clean, uniform broad strike, the more attention the coin tends to receive. Condition still amplifies everything. A high-grade coin with one of these errors holds far more appeal than a worn example, because the details remain crisp enough to highlight the irregularity. Even the smallest differences in preservation can push a coin from being overlooked to being actively sought after, especially when the error is strong enough to be easily recognized without magnification. There's also a subtle shift in how these coins are collected. Rather than chasing just the year, collectors often look for something distinctive, something that makes one 1982 coin different from another. That could be a cleaner surface, a better strike, or a visible minting flaw that adds individuality. It turns a common coin into something that feels more personal, more specific, and ultimately more desirable. In terms of value, a typical high-grade 1982 2-cent coin usually falls around $3 to $12, depending on how clean and well-preserved it is. Once you factor in mint errors, the range increases noticeably. Partial collar and broad strike examples often bring between $15,000 and $20,000, with stronger, clearer pieces sometimes pushing beyond that in the right auction setting. The next coin comes from closer to the end of the series, and that's where things start getting even more interesting. Next up, by 1988, the Australian 2-cent coin was moving quietly toward the final stretch of its life, still circulating widely, but already losing its importance in everyday transactions, and that subtle shift shows in the way these coins are found today. Most examples feel tired, surfaces dulled down, edges softened, the once detailed frill-necked lizard now appearing almost blended into the background from years of wear. That's the standard expectation, which is exactly why a sharply preserved 1988 coin feels so different the moment you see it. When the design still holds depth, when the lettering stands firm, and the fields reflect light more cleanly, it creates an immediate contrast against the typical worn-out pieces that dominate this year. There's something distinct about the look of better-preserved 1988 coins. Instead of the heavy, dark brown tone that often settles in after long circulation, some pieces retain a smoother, more even finish, sometimes with hints of the original copper warmth still visible beneath the surface. It's not just about shine, it's about balance. A coin that hasn't been overly scratched or marked carries a kind of quiet clarity, where nothing distracts from the design itself. Even small imperfections can break that effect, so finding a cleaner example becomes more meaningful than it might seem at first glance. But what truly shifts attention toward this year is how certain coins break away from that normal, expected appearance. Minting anomalies start to stand out more clearly when the rest of the coin is relatively plain, and in 1988, those anomalies can be surprisingly striking. Double strikes, for instance, create a layered effect where the design appears slightly duplicated or shifted, giving the coin a sense of motion frozen in metal. It's the kind of feature that doesn't need explanation. You see it instantly, and it feels different in a way that a standard coin never does. Off-center strikes bring an even stronger visual impact. When a portion of the design is missing and replaced by a blank arc of metal, it changes the entire composition of the coin. The more pronounced the shift, the more dramatic the result, especially if key details like the date remain visible. These are the kinds of pieces that don't just sit quietly in a collection, they stand out immediately, even to someone who isn't deeply familiar with coins. What makes 1988 particularly interesting is that these errors don't appear as frequently in everyday finds, which adds a layer of difficulty for collectors searching through bulk coins. That rarity of discovery adds to the appeal, because when one does turn up, it feels less like a routine find, and more like something that slipped through unnoticed for years. Each error carries its own identity, shaped by whatever went wrong during that brief moment in the minting process, and that uniqueness is exactly what drives interest. Condition once again ties everything together. A worn coin with an error still has value, but a cleaner example preserves the full visual effect, making the anomaly easier to see and more appealing overall. The combination of a strong, obvious error and a well-kept surface is what transforms a simple 2-cent coin into something that collectors actively pursue rather than casually pass over. In terms of value, most high-grade 1988 2-cent coins tend to sit around $2 to $5, reflecting their general availability. However, once a clear and noticeable error is present, the numbers shift upward. Double strikes can reach $8,000 to $12,200, while strong off-center examples often fall between $21,000 and $25,000, depending on how dramatic and well-preserved they are, with standout pieces occasionally attracting even higher bids in auction settings. If you've made it this far, you already know these small copper coins can hide far more than their face value suggests, and sometimes the difference between an ordinary piece and something worth real money comes down to the tiniest detail. So before you ignore that next coin, take a second look. Because you never know what might be sitting right in your hand. If you enjoy discovering rare coins, hidden errors, and real auction values, make sure to subscribe and stick around, because the next find might be even bigger.